we can look at, the individual genes and what we're measuring and kind of look at the mechanism of actions behind them. There's certain genetic pathways that are definitely kind of compounded from stress. On the original clocks, about a third of what they're measuring are on or near those glucocorticoid receptor elements. So definitely showing a connection to stress. One of my favorite papers too that I think is weirdly but beautifully written is out of Harvard, out of Dr. Vadim Gladishev's lab by Dr. Jesse Poganik, which is just showing biological ages increase, but upon stressor, but restored through recovery mechanisms. So they looked at really extreme stressors, so it's rather obvious, but it's still great to have the research behind it. And the stressors they looked at in particular are going to be severe COVID-19, elective versus unelected surgeries, and then pregnancy, of course, too.
Hannah, welcome to the Root Cause Medicine podcast.
Thanks, Kate. I'm excited to be here today.
I'm so excited to have you. You have one cool test on our platform. I love the TruAge test. It is so comprehensive. It's so complete. And I think a lot of people are going to love this episode for hearing about what they can learn about their aging, their rate of aging, their risk for disease moving forward. But before we dive into all of that, can you tell us a little bit about your company and the testing you offer?
Yes, of course. We offer what's called TruAge Complete, or just our TruAge now. It's the only kit we currently offer, and it's solely based on epigenetic DNA methylation. And for those who don't know what that means, no worries, we can dive a little bit deeper into it too. But we're essentially just measuring the expression levels of your genetic patterns on top of your DNA. So quite literally how you as an individual are interacting with the environment, your behavior, your habitual routines. And epigenetics is really most popularized, though, through its ability to predict biological age. So a lot of people actually end up stumbling upon TruDiagnostic, our company, because they want to measure their number one risk factor for all-cause mortality and morbidity, which is going to be that biological aging itself. So it's a really, easy kit to use. It's just a blood spot finger prick card, and we have the lab locally here in Lexington, Kentucky. So everything is processed here. But geez, I think if we've learned anything in the past year, it's been that epigenetics is just a really cool biomarker. It can not only predict age, we're finding out, but it's the best at predicting age. And for the practitioners listening, that's what you're primarily going to use it as or for in your practice at this time.
Yeah, I want to dive a little bit into two more things about this. One, let's talk about the evidence behind the technology you're using and the connections that you're making between what you're seeing on the test and someone's bigger picture of health. But why would someone use this other than just say to someone, hey, here's your biological age and have it be a cool moment? Why are practitioners using this in practice?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because it really, when this testing or when biological age testing first came out, where you could measure it through epigenetics, it was like this novel kind of sexy one-time party trick test, right? Where people were going around on social media or conferences saying, hey, I just tested, like, I'm older or I'm younger, right? And that's it. And you're kind of like, oh, that's cool. Like, maybe I'll do it. I'm not really sure what this means. What it means now is really a stronger predictor of anything or any other testing that's actually out there. And I think the advancements we've made in the past year have allowed us to actually understand how to affect change within the biological age markers. So that's relatively new. We can now tell you why or how you've been aging, which I think is such an important point, because again, it goes back to the fact, why test in the first place? If you're testing, you get a result, and you're not able to change that result, that can be really frustrating, not only as a provider because you can't provide that information, but to your patient as well. They're thinking, well, why did I pay this money? Or why did I go through the collection process? So I think providers ultimately want to take this test, and we've seen an uptake of this test just because aging is becoming a main priority for people, right? They're no longer waiting until they're actually sick. We're really facing a true kind of healthcare model, more of that preventative care model, which, are most, or I would say, are many of the healthcare providers at Rupa too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even if you just look at the first page of the report that comes with the TruAge Complete, it's got like over 10 different sections that are about to be covered when you open the pages, right? We're going to talk about your immune system, pace of aging, relationship with type 2 diabetes risk, your weight loss, your mitotic clock. So let's go through some of the things that are included in this report that actually give people a really comprehensive picture of their overall health. Because like you said, it's not that you just get this back and it says you're 43 when maybe you might be 45. There's some really intensive deep dives you're doing into specific aspects of aging. And if you're okay with it, I also just want to start with what exactly is being measured with this test. So we alluded to it, right? Epigenetics and methylation. Can you walk us through on a cellular level, what is being picked up in your laboratory in Kentucky when you're looking at this?
Yeah, I think it's good to even just define epigenetics really briefly and, DNA methylation, what we're actually measuring. So epi is actually a Greek prefix. It just means above or on top of. So we're quite literally looking on top of your genome. And there are many epigenetic modifications, probably upwards of like 8 to 10 now that keep being added to the list. And we're specifically interested in studying DNA methylation. Not to be confused with like the MTHFR gene, right? That's just one of the 50 million kind of methylation pathways in your body. But we're quite literally looking at these light switches or these light dimmers. If there is a just CH3 group present on the cellular level at a CPG or cytosine guanine with a phosphate bond holding it together. So what that means is if that molecule, if that CH3 group is present, you're just going to be considered methylated, and downstream that gene is going to be shut off. And the same is true of the opposite. So if that CH3 group is not present, you're going to be unmethylated and that gene is going to be turned on. So think about it not in terms of, hey, we want everything turned off or we want everything turned on. That's not necessarily the goal. What I really like to say is we like to shift these methylation markers in your favor through lifestyle factors, supplements, medications, procedural-based therapies. And a good example of that is, we don't want our tumor suppressor genes to be methylated and turned off, right? We want to suppress our tumors. But we do want our oncogenes or our cancer genes to be methylated and turned off because we don't want cancer. So it's definitely a balance, right? And the one way to kind of measure all of those positions in a way to make it easily understandable by the patient is by kind of getting that age outcome, right? I sound like a broken record. I keep coming back to aging is that number one risk factor for all-cause mortality and morbidity. Even when you compare it to someone's smoking habits or BMI or male versus female, hypertension, et cetera. Those are some of the traditional risk factors we think of when it comes to, disease states. But really aging as a risk factor dwarfs all of those other risk factors too.
Love that. So when a test gets to your lab, are you looking at a specific number of genes and methylation sites? Like put this in numbers for us.
Yep. When you send a sample to our lab, we receive it. We're going to take it through our pipeline and processes in our lab. And we actually look at about 1 million of those DNA methylation markers. Yeah, it really is crazy. What's even crazier, though, is there's actually 28 million in your body in every single cell type. You could measure all of that if you wanted to. It'd be extremely, extremely expensive. And there'd just be a lot of data that you wouldn't use because we don't know what it means. So we use an Illumina array-based or B-chip technology. So we kind of run it on these like really pretty iridescent kind of chips, like think of it just like a chip. And essentially those 1 million were picked by Illumina's team and staff as being the most predictive of aging or other disease states. And for those who aren't familiar with Illumina either, they are basically a company who makes all of the hardware for kind of laboratory testing. They've sequenced over, I think, 96% of the world's genomes. So they're also like a massive leader just in this space.
Wow. So out of 28 million genes and sites, how did you pick these 1 million to focus on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so those are going to be what's represented in that specific B chip. So we know we have to go from 28 million to, at least $500,000 or $1 million to cut cost, right? But the Illumina team's going to be the real researchers behind that. So they're going to be looking at positions that are most predictive of cancer, for example, or heart disease, or related to aging itself. What's really cool is actually we published a paper with a couple people from different universities and even from Illumina themselves to help create their newest chip. So we were able to even put, our vision or opinion kind of into the creation of this new hardware that you can kind of run the sample on.
That's amazing. So when we're talking about picking these genes based on the science, let's dive into that for a second, because there's a robust body of research that supports what you're checking for in terms of biomarkers and their correlation with health. So what is some of the research that makes you feel really confident that the biomarkers that you guys are looking at really tell a very broad story about someone's whole health picture?
Yeah. Another really great question, Kate. And there are 5 things that I think people just need to look at in epigenetic clocks. And by epigenetic clock, like what does a clock mean? It's just the nomenclature on how these like algorithms are called, I guess, or developed, right? When you think of clock, you kind of think of like how much time has passed. So it's kind of a fun way for people to denote and talk about what we're actually reporting. So I'd love to go through those 5 points. I think they're so important. Whenever anyone sends me a new published paper in the space, or I find one, I get those Google alerts all the time. I ask myself just these kind of 5 questions, or actually look for these 5 things. And if they don't really check at least even one of these boxes, I'm probably not going to read the whole paper, maybe the abstract to be informed about it. But the first thing I personally think is the most important, and this one seems rather simple, but these biological epigenetic age clocks have to be published, and they have to be in peer-reviewed journals. So not just any type of journal, because if they're published, you really know everything about the algorithm or the clock. The second half of this is it's essentially then how predictive it is of outcomes. So I keep coming back to that, right? Where there used to be these older iterations of biological age clocks called first generation clocks. Those first generation clocks were originally created by Dr. Gregory Hannum and Steve Horvath in 2013. And they were great. We could not be where we are today without them. But essentially, those first generation clocks were just trained using chronological age. So they're still good predictors of all-cause mortality, morbidity, but less so than even the second generation or third generations, which use other underlying data like clinical lab values, metabolites, proteins, maybe functional tests as well, grip strength, gait speed, VO2 max, or FEV1 to become even better predictors of all-cause mortality and morbidity. So that's a lot of words, but I think, just wanting to look for these kind of clocks that are published in this space. That's number one.
I think that's so important. So I actually want to dive in there for a second. When you said that these newer clocks take into account things like grip strength, et cetera, what I'm hearing is these newer clocks are more accurate because in the studies, they compared these clocks with these other biomarkers to come up with these new calculations that are even more advanced. So it's just more information, a bigger data set that was being used to give an even more precise picture of someone's biological age and rate of aging.
Yeah. Yep,
Sweet.
Exactly right. You got
it. That's amazing. It also seems like a really short time to go from first generation to third generation. That it's only been 11 years. So it sounds like the research in this area is just exploding. Who are some of the people doing this research?
Oh, there's so many people doing epigenetic research. It's crazy. We're creating an entirely new field of medicine, which is crazy to say. For our clocks in particular, we partnered with Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Duke. The collaborators at all of those universities are absolutely amazing to work with. We also do a lot of clinical trials too, just with our healthcare providers. So they're collecting a lot of this information alongside of the DNA methylation, other lab values or just, patient kind of intake questionnaires. So they'll track their patients over time and start to see how their biological ages are being affected within their cohort clinics. So pretty much everyone we're working with is doing some type of research. And it's a super collaborative field, and we definitely need more of that.
I love seeing your test being mentioned in studies and even books that are coming out, right? About like how to reduce your biological age. We talked to Kara Fitzgerald. I mean, this stuff is so inspiring. I want to get back to your 5 points because you mentioned 2 of them. And then I, of course, interrupted you because I got super excited. What are the other 3 things you look for?
No worries. Sorry, that one was combined into one, actually.
Oh, got it.
It's
okay.
a longer one. But yeah, I would just say published, right? Because then it's predictive.
Yeah.
But number 2 is kind of one we already actually hinted at as well. So it's a good leeway, which is these clocks have to correlate with quality of life outcomes, both health span and lifespan. So we talked about some of those, right? Meaning if you have a biological age clock and it's accelerated, it should also show that you have weaker grip strength, slower gait speed, more cognitive decline over time, and even faces that are rated as older looking. So there's a really popular image with the DunedinPACE that shows, people who are all 45 years old chronologically, but they look super different according to if their pace is slower, average, or faster too. So it just has to be predictive of not how long you're living, but the amount of healthy years you have at the end of your life, that health span metric.
Now, you mentioned DunedinPACE. Can you tell our listeners what that is if they're not familiar with that?
Yes, it's my favorite. I think biological age clock. It's really cool. It's different. This is the only 3rd generation clock that's ever been created, and it's called a 3rd generation clock because it measures the same group of individuals, about 1,000 people from Dunedin, New Zealand, which is why it's called that crazy name, over 53 years. And they're still studying that group today. They have about a 96% retention rate in that study. So they were able to create almost a speedometer instead of like an overarching biological age. So your result would come out between 0.6 and 1.4. If you're right in the middle at 1, you're just aging 1 biological year for every 1 chronological year. So you obviously want to be, as low as possible. It's gotten super popularized too, which is why I think I kind of like it with like the Kardashians and Brian Johnson and his Rejuvenation Olympics. So people usually tend to be more familiar with that one. Like patients will end up bringing that one to their healthcare provider saying, "Oh, I want to be tested."
Oh, awesome. Okay. And you have like a whole section on this in the report.
Yeah, that one too, I think, even leading to one of our next things to look for in epigenetic clocks. So the 3rd thing is it has to respond to interventions, not too much, but enough, and to interventions that we know should be improving our underlying biology. And I bring this 3rd point up because the DunedinPACE does such a good job at this. The DunedinPACE is really one of the only clocks that could capture caloric restriction at the time, a couple years ago when the calorie randomized control trial was released. So this is just a trial where they looked at healthy people and performed a 10% overall caloric restriction over 2 years. And those older 1st generation clocks increase with caloric restriction. So we know, again, something's off there, right? They're picking up something that isn't great. That's not a true reflection of biological age. But DunedinPACE statistically significantly decreases over that caloric restriction trial. So that's a really kind of good example to tie DunedinPACE in there.
Awesome. Okay, I got to hear the last 2.
Last 2. All right, we're moving through these. One, again, you already kind of mentioned, you're doing such a great job. I know you don't know this list, is we have to have like an accuracy check, right? Mm-hmm. Or like you mentioned at the beginning, like, why should we trust this science? Or like, what's being done on the back end to make sure this is legit? So accuracy, if we're defining, the true dictionary definition, just means you're hitting something that's known, right? We're hitting the bullseye on the dartboard. Well, we don't know our biological age, right? So we can't measure accuracy. So if we wanted to be super, super technical, what we want to say we're measuring is precision, meaning, how many times can we hit the 15 on the dartboard in the same exact spot over and over again. And this is what's measured through something called an ICC value, or intra-class correlation coefficient, in statistics. And it's just saying, hey, if you take 2 samples at the same exact time, how highly correlated are they to one another? Mm-hmm. And usually this comes out as like a value between like 0 and just 1. And anything above 0.9 is considered excellent. So you really want to look for kind of that precision value. And of course, if we go back to number 1, anything that's published on is should have an ICC value.
And so talk to me a little bit about the difference between the old clocks and their ICC and the ones that you're using in this test.
Yeah, absolutely. This is really kind of crazy to even explain and give a true example. So, the first generation clocks, the kind of Horvath clock that people are familiar with, that can have up to a 30% variance in some studies, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Right. So let's make up a scenario. Let's imagine you test your biological age with a first generation clock, the Horvath clock in this case, and it's 60. You come back and you're 60. That means that your sample could vary as much as 18 years if you test the same sample twice. So the issue here is if you test 1 year apart and you're wanting to know if what you're doing is working or not, how do you know if this is like a true age-related change or just an error in the measurement? So it's super, super interesting. And again, this is published, right? The Horvath clock is a first-generation clock. It's really popular. It's published that this clock has pretty poor ICC value. And even some studies, it has an ICC value around 0.4, which would be considered very poor.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so these newer ones that we're talking about, the ones that you guys are relying on, what do we see with those?
Yeah, so they're just going to have less than a 5% variance. You'll never ever like get to an ICC value of 1. If we lived in like a perfect bubble boy world, we would. But it's like there'll be minuscule things that add up, right? Like how you ship it, the tech that's handling it, like when it arrives, say you send it in 2 different envelopes, right? So those things will just add up to have a little bit of variance over time. But we can say with confidence that they're very, very highly representative of one another. And we have people test this all the time that actually, take 2 samples at the same exact time. They send them in and they're very happy with their results.
Yeah, it's really cool how precise, and you guys are on the leading edge of all this science, which I really appreciate, because I feel like we did a boot camp together a couple of months ago and listening to the hours of lecture, the hours of research presentations. It was so impressive knowing that you guys are out in front, wanting your technology and your report to be the most accurate possible. I think you guys include something in this report that some people may not have heard of before. And it's the epigenetic biomarker proxies. So if you're okay with it, I wanted to switch into that because some people might be thinking, all right, I'm going to see how fast I'm aging, at my current biological age. But they're going to see some biomarkers mentioned in this report that they're used to seeing on their regular lab work, like DNA, M, hemoglobin A1C, right? What does that mean?
Yeah. And okay, you're just doing this perfectly too, Kate. That's the last point of the like 5 things we would check for, which again, we kind of hinted at the beginning, is we need to be able to tell you why you're aging, right? Or how you're aging. Yeah. So this is where these EBPs come in, or epigenetic biomarker proxies come in. This is what starts to, I would say, maybe lose some people or ruffle some feathers because it's just such a new idea. It's, these epigenetic biomarker proxies, this is a term that we coined, but it's not a new idea. There are many research groups who have done this in the past and called these same things like epi scores or epi signs or epi predictors. But we call them EBPs, or epigenetic biomarker proxies. So these are surrogate predictors from DNA methylation alone. The EBPs are not meant to be a replacement for direct laboratory measurements, but a lot of times they offer additional value beyond the direct laboratory measurement. One example we really like to use is the DNA methylation CRP that we have on our report. Mm-hmm. It's actually more reliable than your traditional and nonspecific CRP.
Whoa.
And yeah, the DNA methylation CRP is predictive of brain health outcomes, which we know the traditional CRP is not. So as research evolves, new insights will add even more context to these EBPs. But going back to your example, you can see exactly on the report, what's out of range. And for example, we may have fasting glucose and HbA1c out of range, but their traditional clinical lab values look okay. This could mean we're seeing a super, super early hint of maybe some insulin sensitivity issues or insulin resistance in this patient. Depending on how you practice as a provider, you can go anywhere from lifestyle recommendations, supplements maybe like dihydroberberine, or medications like the GLP-1s, metformin, SGLT2 inhibitors. So it's up to you regarding what you want to do about kind of these outcomes that are out of range. But I always like to give that example just because obviously it's a really easy and simple one. They're not all that easy and simple. But for anyone who has that out of range, stick a CGM on them and you will notice glucose spikes, and like rather probably severe ones too, where they just don't come down to a homeostatic level and they're kind of just at a spike all day, every day. And then obviously they're changing their diet, maybe reducing stress, taking some more of those lifestyle approaches, which in turn, then they'll take the test 6 months later and start to see those drop as well and see their overall aging drop too.
I want to dive into so many different parts of what you just said, but I want to start with the one thing that you mentioned, which is that people will retest. And so earlier you said like part of your criteria is, when we're looking at this, does it change in response to an intervention? We have to know that to make sure that what we're looking at on this test actually has clinical utility. How long does it typically take to see a change in biological age? And I know it's going to depend based on the intervention and intensity, but are you seeing folks retest every 3 months, every 6 months, every year?
Yeah, I would say usually every 6 months, I would say, is pretty much the norm. It's super dependent on the person, though. We have people test every quarter, even sooner than that. But I would say if you really want to understand these markers, make sure you're starting off doing quarterly or 6 months. Once you start to understand and you're getting like consistent results back, maybe then you move on and expand or extend that a couple more months. And then once you feel like you've gotten that rhythm, you can expand to every year. What's really hard is when people start to test like once a year or once every 2 years, and they don't remember what they did in between, right? Or they're fluctuating and took them 3 years apart, right? It's really hard then to pinpoint, hey, why are we actually seeing those fluctuations? But I love doing reviews with the longitudinal information, especially when people have the clinical lab data and their genomic profile done, and you can start to kind of put all of these like strings together and really start to paint that clinical picture.
Yeah, I can see how this would be so valuable. First of all, it's kind of like just a bonus. I mean, even if you just had your biological age and your rate of aging, that alone would be so valuable. But you get so much extra information with this test that's really impressive. And I can see this being really valuable for a couple groups of people. In terms of the EBPs for a second, those epigenetic biomarker proxies, I have a subset of clients I'm thinking of who are either elite athletes or they're really passionate about reducing their risk for something like a neurodegenerative disorder or something they saw a parent get. They want to be early. They want to be doing every single thing they possibly can to reduce their risk. And what's frustrating typically for those two groups of people, the performance-oriented and the prevention-oriented, is to get some standard labs back and be told, everything's normal, you're fine. They might even run it through like an optimal lab checker and they're thinking, well, I know I have this risk or I know I don't feel well. What else can I do? And so going down even deeper and looking at things like this DNA methylation HSCRP is a really cool tool for that person who's wondering, I want the most detailed answer I could possibly get, the earliest predictor of dysfunction I could possibly get, so I can hop on it, make a change, and then actually assess if it's working. So I love all the information that you guys are providing in this. It's really, really cool. You have another thing called SYMPHONYAge. So what's the difference between the DunedinPACE, the SYMPHONYAge? What are we measuring here?
Yep. I was hoping you were going to ask about that one. So, we offer kind of three main aging outcomes. We have MAGE, which we talked about a little bit with the individual EBPs. That individual clock we created with Harvard is the most predictive of mortality. So if that's what you're interested in, you want to focus on that first clock. The DunedinPACE, on the other hand, is more an instantaneous rate of aging. So if you're interested in, hey, is what I'm doing working, right? Understand where your speedometer of aging is. That's more of like a 3 to 6 month running average of how quickly you're aging. But the SYMPHONYAge, we just launched this one at the end of June, and we're getting such good feedback from our healthcare providers. This is one we just created with Yale, and it's the aging of 11 different organ systems. So again, when we go back to that last point of like, how are these clocks validated? What do they really mean? We can even tell you the why and how you're aging through those organ systems. And those organ systems include your kidney age, heart, hormone, immune, brain, lung, metabolic, musculoskeletal, blood, liver, and inflammation. So again, the granularity is really what we're going for. I think, we'll have some really exciting information for you all here in a couple months. We're publishing a paper with Yale looking at about 75 to 100 interventional trials, even ones like Dr. Kara Fitzgerald, and actually measuring all of the clocks that have been created to date on each individual study, because there's gaps in the literature, right? Like some studies did this intervention, this timeline, but only these 2 clocks, right? We want to know how all the clocks perform on them. So that'll be some really, really fun data to sift through and to present on once it's available.
Absolutely. I love that. The organ systems focus is so incredible. And I want to reflect to the listeners here, guys, if you haven't gone and become a provider on the TruDiagnostics portal or through Rupa Health, I think it's really important to know that the test that we're talking about here is not thousands of dollars. This test on the Rupa platform is under $400. You're getting all of this information. It is truly so, so cool. And I want to go back to something you said about the MAGE that you guys developed in partnership with Harvard. Can you talk about the magnitude of the study? Like how many people were involved? How many biomarkers? The numbers shocked me. So yeah, tell us about that study.
Oh yeah, this one's really cool. So when we were founded in 2020, our one goal was just to create the best epigenetic age clock that was ever created. And to do this, what you're asking about, obviously, is that we needed an extensive amount of data, which is why we partnered with researchers from Harvard and their biobank. So their biobank is obviously state of the art, and it included thousands of samples we saved over the past 50 years. So with those samples, we were able to collect an extensive amount of this interconnected biodata needed to create the most accurate predictors of biological aging. So we're really happy with the results. But essentially what we did in about 5,000 people is quantify 26,000 untargeted protein groups, 8,500 metabolites, and 61 clinical lab variables, alongside of the million DNA methylation markers. So going back to that first point, right? The more data we can generate and get at the same exact time, the more we can better power the algorithm to predict different diseases and death itself, and then tell you the why behind it too. So we're able to report out those EBPs because of how we trained it with all of that additional information. So yes, that was a really, really long project, but literally one that we started right when we opened because we realized something was needed in this space. So that initial publication we had with them showed that the MAGE algorithm was the clock that was better at predicting health and aging outcomes than any other DNA methylation age clock created to date.
It's amazing. I mean, the way you guys are developing this test, it seems like you're out in front with the research, and then you're taking the data that we know is true, that we all wish we could have access to for insights about our own health, and making it available. And this is actually a bit different than the development of some of the other tests we see, right? Sometimes we see a test that has this list of biomarkers, 50 of them have been validated with maybe 1,000 people study or less, and some of them haven't, right? Some of them are just there. I really love that with your test, there's a study behind every single thing, at least one study, usually multiple, behind every single thing that's included. It's a really, really cool approach to taking a concept in a field and making it accessible for everyone to improve their own life. You mentioned DunedinPACE. So you mentioned these numbers, and I neglected to have you clarify. You said it goes from 0.6 to 1.4, and it's your rate of aging. I just want to clarify for our listeners, if you're at a 0.6, you can generally infer that that means you're aging at about 0.6 per years per actual chronological year. Do you want to explain that in a more eloquent way than I'm able to our audience?
Yeah, you're right. That's the goal, right? Is you want to be as low as possible. So if you're at 0.6, you're right, Kate, you're aging 0.6 biological years for every one chronological year. And people usually then say, well, can I get it lower, or what's the goal? And you technically can get it lower, not by much, but that's just kind of the cohort on which we trained off of. Those were the parameters we were able to get at either end. I usually say kind of the goal, obviously, is as low as possible. But if you wanted to start to head into it like an optimal area, try to aim for 0.7, 0.75. You can then think about it in quarters almost. So it's not super impressive if you hit that one. So I'll give you, a pat on the back. But what's super, super impressive is when you're consistently right at that 0.7, or 0.075. So you can think of it, hey, if you keep it there for like 4 years, you're going to shave a biological age off of your overarching age.
Wow. That's a great way to think about that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Easier to understand. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to talk about the immune markers you've got in here, telomeres. But before we do, I just want to take a step back. So you founded this company in 2020. You guys are clearly obsessed with this science, right? How has being in this space impacted your own health?
Ooh, that's a great question. Probably not well at first because it was the startup environment. I remember, I don't know what it was I did. I tested like early days, and my pace of aging was like off the roof for people of my same chronological age. But it was probably just like, being deep in everything, if I'm being honest. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's definitely made me more health conscious, super aware of my own health. I feel like I've always been like healthy-ish or healthy, but really being able to push those boundaries. So I practice caloric restriction pretty much daily. I still think that's really, really helps. It's not for everyone. So, we don't need everyone. Just like, it doesn't mean skipping a meal. You have to do it, in a way that works well for your body. But also I've definitely worked on like stress reduction techniques. So not too long ago, I was even, I got certified in TM, Transcendental Meditation, which was like a really cool process that I learned from like other people being in this space. So it's really unique to be able to talk with, university, academics, and kind of related partners, and then the healthcare providers too, because you're starting to see some of that translation into the clinic. And then you're also just getting a bunch of like really cool health tips and insights from the healthcare providers, different things you can follow that are super easy to do and don't cost a lot of money as well. So it's definitely helped me be more health conscious.
I love that. Well, and you mentioned stress management. I mean, because I'm assuming being very stressed can accelerate your pace of aging. Do we know like the mechanisms that are contributing to that?
Yeah. I mean, we can look at, the individual genes and what we're measuring and kind of look at the mechanism of actions behind them. There's certain genetic pathways that are definitely kind of compounded from stress. On the original clocks, about a third of what they're measuring are on or near those glucocorticoid receptor elements. So definitely showing a connection to stress. One of my favorite papers too, that I think is like weirdly but beautifully written, is out of Harvard, out of Dr. Vadim Gladishev's lab by Dr. Jesse Poganik, which is just showing biological ages increase, but upon stressor, but restored through recovery mechanisms. So they looked at really extreme stressors, so it's rather obvious, but it's still great to have the research behind it. And the stressors they looked at in particular are going to be severe COVID-19, elected versus unelected surgeries, and then pregnancy, of course, too. So yeah, it's really, really interesting to start to get some of that data back behind it.
What recovery methods were they looking at?
Just time, just like time passing.
No way.
So yeah, it could be, and that's a good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. Like, are there other things that can speed up that process? Which I'm sure there are, but yeah, just time. And each are going to be a little bit different. So, also if you're interested in taking the test, we say like, don't take it when you're sick, right? When you're doing like a lot of traveling, probably wait, at least a couple weeks. If you want to be super safe, you can wait a couple months or so. That way you're able to recover a bit too, because we know that can impact the scores.
Wow. That brings a new meaning to the saying time heals all wounds.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, for real. That. Yeah. Okay. Tell us about telomeres. People might have heard, okay, I know I can look at my telomere length and tell if I'm healthy, tell how long I have been alive. Like, what are telomeres? Why do you guys measure them? And what can you tell when you look at them?
Yes. Oh, telomeres. We are, not huge fans of telomeres anymore. So we offer them on our legacy report, it's called. So they're still available. We'll always offer them, but kind of on the new updated reporting section, we actually remove them. So the reason we did this is just because telomeres are a really poor predictor of aging. You can definitely still create a biological age from it. Yeah, but going through that list of things, they're just not very predictive of disease or kind of death as we once thought they were. The research kind of left us hanging a bit. So they're still super popularized. People really like them. I think they're still a great metric to have, especially if you kind of want to look into your senescent cell burden. But they're just not kind of a main part of that overall report.
Okay. So guys, this is why you need to be taking a test that's developed by people on the leading edge. I love it. Okay, let's talk about the immune system markers that you're looking at. So I don't think folks would expect to see words like CD4 cells, CD8 cells, B cells, T cells. They're thinking, hang on a second, you guys are looking at my DNA. Why are you talking to me about immune system cells? Why do you include these biomarkers in this test?
Yeah. So again, this goes back to like that idea of EBPs, right? Being able to report out other things through the lens of DNA methylation. And you're talking about our immune cell subset panel. So for healthcare providers who run an immune cell subset panel, this is really expensive. It's about $1,000. UCLA, for example, has a really good panel. It's a logistical nightmare, though. It's I think a plasma sample you have to ship on dry ice. And it's also a $6 billion industry. And we're kind of just replacing that as an additional metric. So this is something we published a while back in 2023 in July with Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, comparing our predictors, our methodologies to flow cytometry, right? The real results. And they're highly, highly replicable of one another. So just shows you, again, the value that epigenetics can really add. And the highlight of the report is exactly what you said at the beginning, Kate. Really, I would say in terms of clinical, what's clinically applicable is really that CD4, CD8 T cell ratio.
Let's tell people why. So this might be the first time someone has heard that mentioned. Why specifically is this being called out in this report?
Mm-hmm. So I would say it's just the most well documented, right? In terms of indicating the status of your overall immune system. So your CD4 cells, they lead the fight against infections. Your CD8 cells can kill cancer cells and other invaders. So we really want to see an optimal number here. Usually optimal would be between 2.5. If you're below 1, you're going to be immunosuppressed at the time you took this test. And, we recommend immune boosters, vitamin D, zinc. There are some other options as well. And if you're over 4, you're going to be hyperreactive, right? I think kind of autoimmune disease or disorder, but that's more non-specific too. Mm-hmm.
I just want to reiterate to people at home, like you can do this test at home. It's a finger stick. So For me to normally run all the biomarkers that we're talking about with this EBPs, I'd have to send somebody for a blood draw, like you just said, and it would be multiple tubes, a very complicated draw because some of it has to be shipped with dry ice. And with a finger stick at home, we're getting all of this really valuable data. One of the other things that you guys call out in this is the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. Why is that included?
The neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio?
Yeah.
Yeah, the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. This one is what's called a stressometer. So some people think of it kind of as like a little meter system. And higher values are really going to indicate stress. Really, really high values could be super kind of early warning signs for more like pathological state or processes like atherosclerosis, infection, inflammation, psychiatric disorders, even cancers in some states. So we usually like to see this outcome fall between 1 and 3, but it's usually just an indicator of stress on the body.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, I'm only going to quiz you a couple more times. There's so much.
Let's do it.
There's so much in here. You are such a trooper. I know, you really can. So, all right, let's talk about mitotic clock. What is that? Why are we measuring it?
Yeah, the mitotic clock is an interesting one. This actually looks at your number of stem cell divisions. So it was kind of originated through this idea of the bad luck hypothesis, which is a hypothesis. It's not a theory quite yet, but the hypothesis is why do we see more like breast and lung cancer compared to head and neck or brain cancer or pelvic bone cancer, for example. And if you actually plotted kind of the stem cell division for each of those cancers, you'll see that the more prominent kind of prevalent cancers have increased stem cell divisions for that particular tissue. So this is just kind of a test that's correlative with cancer. It's definitely not causative. And I mean, you have to be really, really high, like in the 99th percentile to really even start considering like doing maybe some stage 0 liquid biopsy cancer testing or screening, and just being kind of aware of the signs too. So you don't want your stem cells replicating too much, but you also don't want them replicating not at all.
Awesome. We've also got some other things in here. You have a whole weight loss response section. Mm-hmm. Can you talk us through why you guys why would you include that in this test? And yeah,
it's another weird one, I know. So this one is really interesting because, we're only offering what's available on the research, right? What we're really able to come to a conclusion for. This is looking at if you would be susceptible to weight loss through caloric restriction. That's it. And remember, we talked about that earlier, right? Caloric restriction, it's the best hack for longevity and kind of health span. But some people actually use it as a weight loss strategy, and not everyone's going to lose weight from it. This is really dependent more on how you metabolize your calories rather than calories in versus calories out. So we're able to come back and say, hey, you are a full responder. You're going to lose weight with caloric restriction. You're an intermediate responder, which like you may or may not. We may want to try some tips or tricks. You can kind of look at the report and see which way you're leaning to see how far do you want to push. And then there's just like non-responders as well. So people who are not going to be able to lose weight with caloric restriction, where we may then recommend complete dietary changes, physical fitness regimens. Of course, GLP-1s, like you're going to lose weight on those to a certain point. That follows a different mechanism of action here. But it can start to help guide treatment for the healthcare provider too.
It's cool that you're doing that because caloric restriction is so frequently a part of these longevity conversations. For someone who hasn't heard that term before, can you explain what that means? I mean, there's a science behind it. There's a method to it. It isn't just like eating less.
Yep. Yeah. So it's not necessarily even intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding, right? Where you're giving yourself a window of when to consume food or calories. So this is just saying, hey, throughout the 24-hour day, I'm going to eat less. And you don't want to, of course, you don't want to eat less calories, but only go and eat McDonald's or Taco Bell's, right? These have to be quality calories. So one example I really like to give is like, I love breakfast. I always eat breakfast. I never skip it. I do a super high protein breakfast, some like onions, peppers, mushrooms, maybe spinach, a couple more veggies with eggs, and then like a breakfast sausage, whether it's like bacon or sausage. I just started to feel like gross from the bacon, the sausage, right? It's really heavy, it's really greasy. And I made this change like such a long time ago. It seems so natural now, where I just switched over to like turkey bacon, right? Or turkey sausage or chicken sausage. When you do that, you're actually already cutting out like 200 to 300 calories, depending on
Wow.
like what you're actually choosing. So if you eat, if you consume, the remaining calories the rest of the day and kind of follow your regimen, that's already 10%, right, of a 200 caloric diet.
Yeah.
So you're already hitting your mark. So it can just be that simple, right, about just choosing like better foods for you, depending on your diet and what works for your body.
So it's about a 10% reduction of what's typically recommended.
Correct. Yeah. Based on, kind of metabolic rate, also your like athletic based goals, et cetera. And I do want to mention too that the study that I referenced, the calorie randomized control trial earlier, they actually aimed for 25%
Whoa.
caloric restriction. Like no one could do that. So they reduced it back to like, hey, let's try and get like 10% as an average. But the people who did restrict more, like had better aging. The people who restricted less, had, were lesser reduction in aging.
Love it. Yeah. And you guys have heard me talk about this before on the podcast, but that is where tools like Chronometer were actually developed, was like this science that was looking at calorie restriction and its benefits for health and longevity. But then also, the more you restrict your calories, the more you need to be aware of your micronutrient status, right? So like if I'm going to reduce the total food I'm eating, how do I choose the foods that are so going to get me 100% of my daily value of vitamins, minerals, fats, all the important things? So if you're interested in trying this, make sure you're working with an RD or some kind of professional who can really guide you and help you fine tune. Because it's a great strategy, tons of research behind it, but it has to be done right. So I love that you clarified that. Okay. We have gone through so much of this report, and this is just one of the test panels that you guys have available on Rupa with us. So do you want to talk about some of the other tests that you offer that physicians might see when they go look you guys up by lab company?
Yes, we have a couple other really great tests for you all. So again, that's kind of like the main product is our TruAge kind of biological age test based on epigenetics with additional information. But we also have EPISEEK, which is an early cancer detection tool. So we know there's so many cancer deaths in the US. It's like you hear about it all the time now. The incidence of cancer is increasing. And there's really no FDA approved kind of screening test for all types of cancer. So EPISEEK is making progress in detecting early stage cancers that were previously undetectable. So we offer that test that I love. And then we also do, kind of a traditional genomics panel as well. So a lot of doctors use like very general guidelines based on statistics to diagnose and treat most people, right, in the traditional healthcare system. So we've created a pretty unique DNA kit that looks at particular SNPs, and this supports things like nutrition, fitness, sleep, longevity, inflammation, insulin resistance, cardiovascular health, and neurodegenerative conditions. And then I think we actually are the only company that offers PGX testing with you all as well. I may be wrong on that, but the pharmacogenomic testing. So we're able to report out whether a prescription drug would likely be an effective or ineffective treatment option for your patient based on their actual DNA patterns too.
Yes, absolutely. So helpful, guys. If you're considering pharmaceuticals as part of your approach for someone to actually be able to predict how they're going to respond, some of these drugs come with some pretty serious side effects or impacts. And to just be able to choose between different types in a category, the one that's most likely to be a good fit for your patient is incredible. Now, with the EPISEEK, people's ears probably perked up because they're hearing more and more about things like you said, like liquid biopsy, stage 0 cancer screening. What's actually being measured with this test? Like, what's the technology? What are you looking at so that clinicians can feel confident explaining it to their clients?
Yep. So we're doing PCR here with the EPISEEK. So traditionally people like bring up GRAIL, right? They're kind of the gold standard, not because they're the best test, but just because they're the first to market and people really hear about them. We believe in EPISEEK because it's looking at not as a wide array as GRAIL's looking at in terms of cancers, but we're looking very, very deep. That's kind of the defined technology by PCR, where GRAIL is doing next generation sequencing. So they're looking at a lot of different markers, but they're looking at very, very few markers in that particular cancer. So the EPISEEK is going to be more sensitive. It's going to be more specific when compared to GRAIL. It's going to be cheaper, which is nice. And really, regardless of the results that you get from GRAIL or EPISEEK, if you get a positive test, you're going to do the same type of imaging follow-up to detect where that cancer is actually coming from. So that's a little bit about the differences of the technology. We have that testing and distribute it through a company called Precision Epigenomics. They're great. They have an amazing team. Again, the goal is to not test positive.
Mm-hmm.
So they've only had, I think, a couple positives, and they were actually able to track down family history, other variables, and pinpoint what's causing that positive and take action without having to go through and get the additional imaging. So if there is a positive result, their team works very, very closely with you to go through that patient history.
That's amazing. I think a lot of the concern that providers have when they're first learning about this type of testing is, what happens if somebody gets a result that scares them, right?
Right.
What do I do next? Is this team someone I can trust and pick up the phone and call who's going to work with me to help this patient through next steps? I do want you to talk a little bit about specificity for a second, just like the overall predictive value of this test, because there are a lot of different tests on the market with a lot of different sensitivity and specificity values. So can you tell us about yours?
Yes. So I want to make sure I get these numbers right because I don't know them off the top of my head. All right, here we go. I said EPISEEK and GRAIL, right? So really they have kind of there's really three main cancers I think people are primarily concerned with. And that's going to be lung, breast, and pancreatic. So the sensitivity with EPISEEK is going to be GRAIL, and then even with the specificity there as well. So, again, sensitivity is the percentage of people with the disease who are correctly identified by the test. Specificity is the percentage of people without the disease who are correctly excluded by the test. Basically, the EPISEEK is going to have less false positives. So if you do the Gallery test, you have a higher chance of it saying, hey, we detected something when something's not really there, which may also incur, more patient panic, right? Which is not fun for anyone. But they're all great tests. Just depends kind of what you're really wanting to get out of your patients.
In the methodology section, it seems like it was like 65% sensitive, 98% specific. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay. So those are big numbers. Those are good numbers. Those are some of the best numbers on the market. And so I really love what you guys are doing to make this test more accessible. It's under $700 on our platform, which is great for someone who is wanting this information but might not have thousands of dollars to spend. I think it's really a truly awesome tool. And I love that you described how providers can use it, right? So if it comes back positive, then you reflex to work up.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what an awesome tool. So you guys have this really cool collection of tests available to practitioners. We've gone through so much already in this podcast. What is something you want to leave our listeners with?
Oh, what do I want to leave your listeners with? Go back to the TruAge testing. Like, even if you have people that are just curious or, I would say maybe on the fence, right? They're not sure if they want to dive right into it. Like, just try and encourage them to test. I think once you get them in, it's like a tangible report, right? That they can see and say, oh, wow, I am increasing my risk, or, oh, I'm doing great. Like, I want to stay on the right track. So this testing actually really helps patient retention in clinics, especially those who are doing it in like a membership model in their practice where they really are committed to that longitudinal testing. So I think it's worth the risk. I think it's worth the additional kind of insights that you're going to be able to provide the patient as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think even saying to your clients, guys, let's test if what I'm doing is working. Keep me honest, right? As your doctor, I'm going to tell you to do all these interventions. The true test is if they're actually impacting you on a cellular level. And this test is going to give you insights earlier than any other biomarker. So I love what you guys are doing. I love that you have made this clinical tool available for people who want to learn more about you and the company. Where can they find you?
Yeah. And even one thing to add to that, Kate, like, test the patient, right? Are they following your recommendations? True, too, right? I know I'm guilty. I'm like, oh, I haven't taken my supplements, and then I just forget about it. So you could, flip it either way. But people can just go to TruDiagnostic.com if they want to learn a little bit more. We just updated the website. It looks really pretty. So everyone's able to kind of check out what we have to offer.
Awesome. All right. And last question, just a fun question. What is like the newest or coolest thing that you've been doing for your health that you love?
I don't know.
I think TM.
Why are the fun? Transcendental meditation probably. But I'm like, why are the fun questions at the end of the podcast always the ones where I'm like, I have no idea. But yeah, I'll say transcendental meditation. I like it. It's fun. It helps reduce my stress and decrease my biological age. So it's been fun.
Are you one of those people that's like, if I do it 20 minutes a day and it makes me feel like I have extra hours in the day?
Oh, I definitely feel like it takes away. Just because I'll try to do like 20 minutes, in the morning and at night. And sometimes, I'll definitely be guilty of like skipping some days.
Yeah.
But it still takes time, right? So I'll like wake up early or go to bed a little bit early, turn off all of the devices earlier, which again is all like a domino effect in being like positive for my health.
Yeah, like a keystone habit, kind of like if you make that time and you do it, you end up doing all the other things you probably want to do, like phone away, early bedtime. Okay.
Exactly right.
You're inspiring me to do it again. I used to do TM. I got totally away from it. You're reminding me what a good practice it is. So I want to thank you so much for being here. We're going to do way more education with you guys. I'm really thrilled to have your tests on the Rupa platform. Thank you so much for what you're doing to bring root cause medicine to the world.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.